All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here and for joining us for today's session, Youth-Centered Art Making Spaces from Classroom Management to Classroom Culture. My name is Ariel Frost, Ingenuity's Manager of Partnerships and Learning, and I'm also joined here today by Courtney Cintron, Ingenuity's Director of Partnerships and Learning, and today's facilitator, Michael Rangel, Constellation Resident at Ingenuity and Youth Support Manager at SkyART. This morning's session is the first in a series of learning sessions developed and designed by Ingenuity's Learning and Development Program residents. The program is called Constellation because the residents have come together over the last several months to ideate, knowledge share, and workshop their respective learning sessions so that they could elevate key areas of their expertise, research, and experience as art partners and share it back with you all, in essence, creating a partner-to-partner learning network. So thank you to all of the residents for this incredible collaboration and thoughtful work, which will continue to be presented throughout the spring and into the summer. Today's session, developed by Constellation resident Michael Rangel, is the second in a two-part series. Today, we'll focus on reframing our relationship to the classroom. Before we move into today's session, we'd like to acknowledge that this virtual classroom is taking place on the stolen land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa nations. Because of the Great Lakes, the land naturally became a site of travel, healing, trade, and gathering for more than a dozen other Native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois that still practice their traditions and care for the land. As we begin this program, let's honor these ancestral grounds that we're on and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide, and begin to rethink our own relationship with the land and its original peoples. I'd also like to provide you with a content notice for this training program. The content and discussion in today's session and throughout this program will necessarily engage with trauma. Some of the content may be emotionally and intellectually challenging to engage with. We'll also do our best to make this virtual classroom a space where we can engage bravely, empathetically, and thoughtfully with challenging content. Just a few more important notes for you before we begin. If you haven't already, if you'd like, please feel free to update your name with your pronouns and your organization's name. You can do that by hovering over your image icon and selecting the three dots. Please note that for accessibility purposes, today's session will be recorded. Additionally, handouts and slides of this session will be available to you in the chat. Closed captioning is also available and will be utilized throughout the session. And then we have some norms for you that we've divided into a few different categories. So under equity of voice and learning, we have take space, make space. So as a participant, please be mindful of any privileged identities you may hold and help to create an environment for everyone to contribute. And then speak from personal experience. Let's own our statements and views about things and not presume to be able to speak for other people. And then under how we show up for ourselves and each other, we have openness to learning. And this is just an understanding that we're all learners in this space. Flexibility and patience. Things may not always go 100% according to plan, and sometimes technology is at play. So we thank you for your grace and flexibility. And use the chat box mindfully. When you're using the chat box, we ask that you try to make your questions and comments as relevant to what we're talking about as possible. And confidentiality. So take away lessons, but not personal content. We'll sometimes share knowledge and co-share ideas and resources in these sessions, but if anyone shares anything personal, we ask that you don't bring it out of the space. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Michael Rangel of SkyART to guide us through today's session.
Thank you, Ariel and Courtney, so much. And thank you everyone for being here today, for joining, sharing space with me after a long weekend, a hot weekend. As you can see, I have a sweater on because I'm literally sitting under air conditioning right now because everyone in my office is melting. But yeah, I just want to start off by introducing myself, why I'm here, what we're here to do together, and then I'll get into kind of like our agenda. So as they said, my name is Michael Rangel. I use he, him, they, them pronouns, and I am the youth support manager here at SkyART. And so essentially what I do is I manage our art therapy program, which is called Project Impact. And so in that we serve youth both individually and in groups, ages 7 to 24. And also we have the unique opportunity to go into schools and community spaces and provide individual and group art therapy services as well. I'd like to state that off the bat because you will hear me kind of mention art, like return back to it when I use words like expression, experimentation. My background and my entire livelihood and being is surrounded by the arts. And so I'm very blessed and thankful to have this opportunity to lead this program and to do this work, but also to ask these critical questions of like how art has answered these questions for me and how it's continuously challenging them, critiquing them, being very critical of them. So yeah. My training is in social work. So I went to social work school for a couple of years. I've been in the field for about 8 years. Weird to say that I'm in my late 20s. I feel old. I dyed my hair pink, so I was like, why not? But here we are. And today I'm gonna be talking about what it means to shift classroom management to classroom culture. I know both of which are pretty big buzzwords in the educational realm sphere right now. But for me, it comes down to this kind of like foundation, starting point of how we define and how we enact discipline and punishment through these youth spaces. And so essentially that's where management, a lot of times it comes from how we define it and where our kind of like ideas of how to manage classroom spaces are founded in. So I'm gonna start there. From there, I'm kind of gonna talk a little bit about what is classroom management in terms of, in my experience, public schooling and charter schools, and then why it's harmful in a sense. Next, I'm going to kind of touch a little bit on engaging and exploring culture. That's the whole reason why we're here, trying to reshape, rebuild, repair this idea of what it means to manage classrooms to then building culture where we actually center the youth in which we serve. I'm going to walk us through, I call them practice models, but more so just like ways to implement new interventions, new models in your classroom, in your studio spaces, in whatever spaces that you lead and or guide youth. And then, yeah, we'll have time for questions, comments, discussions. Throughout it, something I didn't add in here is I'm going to ask 3 questions of everyone. I know some people, you're probably busy, you're probably listening on the go, or you're somewhere multitasking. But if you have time, I would love for you to engage in the chat and just be a part of the space together. So where we're going to start, I just want to give a little bit of background on the learning objectives for why we're here. I love to set a foundation, kind of understand an outline, and before we actually dive into it. So first, we're going to identify how the transition from management to culture can be unsettling and uncomfortable. I want to state that from the jump because the things I'm going to ask of you, the things I'm going to ask you to advocate for, to push forward, to implement will be uncomfortable. That is growth, right? Whenever, as a therapist, when I talk to my youth about what it means to grow, to reconstruct, to rebuild, I always tell them you're a seedling in dirt. You have to break through. And even for plants, that's a struggle, that's hard. It takes sunlight, it takes nourishment, it takes healing, and that's what we're here for. So it will be unsettling and uncomfortable, just to name that from the jump. Secondly, we're going to explore vulnerability for both provider and youth, which is often not given the appropriate time and space to unpack. And so essentially what that means is, I love the word explore because it means that we can experiment. It means that we can fail and not feel bad about it. It means that we can try new things and that we're looking for them, not just for ourselves, but for others. I'm very intentional when I say both for provider and youth, because we are the people that are leading the young people in our spaces. And so we also have to explore what this vulnerability is, how it's, where it's located in our bodies and how we're using it to our advantage, but also how it's disadvantaging us. I find that as a therapist, I have the unique opportunity to be both an insider and outsider within public schools, within schools in general. And so oftentimes I get the time and space to step back and process what's happening, and then I can go in being very intentional. But for a lot of folks, it's 9 to 5s, going home, grading, thinking about your job, and not necessarily having the time to process. And so I would really love for us to explore that vulnerability. And then lastly, the whole goal of this is to increase our ability and strategies to create affirming culture within the classroom. Of course, it's not an overnight thing. I will often and always say this is a slow burn. If this was a fast thing, then I would just be mimicking the capitalist structures that we live within and under in this world. And that's not what I'm here for. I think things need to take time. it's very hard to learn something new within a matter of weeks to months. And sometimes this could take years, depending on where you're at, and how much buy-in, how much investment, how much impact that you can have with the people around you. So yeah, so we're going to start with those three things. To guide this entire presentation, this project, this movement that I hope will happen within school spaces, specifically in spaces that may be harmful, that may be too discipline heavy. I want to know what happens when we openly practice punitive and disciplinary approaches that impact the youth we serve and do not take into account their lived experience, feelings, or needs. This for me is something that I ask ongoingly when teachers ask, how do you get kids to behave better? Like, how do you get them not to act out? Like, how do you get them to blah, blah, blah? And a lot of times those are very punitive practices and very punitive ways of what they're asking me to do. And I will always say, I don't have an answer for that because I don't know those kids. I'm like, we need to take into account their lived experiences, what's happening in their environments, how is that impacting their need and or want or will to learn and to connect with others? How is that impacting their feelings? I'm within the realm of youth development. It's very common for people to say that behaviors impact feelings. This goes back to like Piaget and all of those old white men that just like studied children, didn't really have a connection or relationship with them. For me, I always say that behaviors come secondary. It always starts with the feeling or something that's rooted within the child that then is acted out through behavior. And so where is that coming from? And then lastly, what are their needs? I think so much of the time, what I've learned here is that a lot of times kids don't have the language or vocabulary to even express what their needs are. And so for me, I have the advantage of having the practice and training and understanding how their art speaks to that. But for everybody else, you know, people always say, use your words, like say what you want, say what you need, but some kids literally have no idea where even to start with that. And so, yeah, what happens when we actually use these punitive and disciplinary approaches? That will impact the youth without taking any of these things into consideration. And so my goal is to redesign our approach on how classrooms, studios, and youth-centered spaces can create healthy, affirming, and brave engagements and impact culture. With this, I want to shift our ideas and remove this conditioning of managing youth and move more into guiding and processing with them. The goal returns to building trust, empathy with the youth so that they can be comfortable and affirmed in who they are and the spaces you share together. So much of the time, I'll keep on saying those three words. It's kind of how I've structured this program and how I'm going to continue to structure it, that I want kids to understand first what healthy means, not just health in a corporal sense of their body, but socially, emotionally, culturally, politically, physiologically, all those things. Next, I want it to be affirming. A lot of times kids go into spaces that are very managed heavy, and it's not taking into account their racial identity, their gendered identity, their sexual identity, and all those things need to be affirmed for them to build trust and have a buy-in into why they're showing up for that. And if it's not affirming, they're not going to be there. And lastly, brave. I think I'm trying to step away from the idea of what safe means, because safe is a very loaded word. A safe space for me will not be a safe space for a young Black queer femme youth. A safe space for them may not be a safe space for me, for somebody that's visibly more queer or whatever that means. So I love that, leaning into more of that, these brave engagements. And the last thing I want to have impact on culture. First, our buy-in and how we shift and how we rebuild it, but also how we're connected to it. So the importance of this shift and rebuilding this connection to culture, I kind of just lay out in these 5 steps that I'm kind of gonna lean in on ongoingly throughout this presentation, but it's to impact our work to reach youth who are not connected to the spaces they are in with others, to decrease the fear and stigma and harm that punishment and discipline puts onto youth, to center both individuality and collaboration of youth that can increase their sense of well-being, to create a communal response and relationship amongst the youth to adults and others, and lastly, to build the trust in the process of art, that art making can begin where they do. And so again, I said I'm going to come back to art because I think it's important in all of this. So yeah, so that's where we're going to start. So next slide. Are we ready for the fun bus? Also, I have a lot of Abbott Elementary things in here because when that show came out, I was mind blown. Shout out to Quinta Brunson. Love her, want to be her best friend. And I know this show for a lot of educators, kind of like for them, they're like, this is so real, this is so raw. But like, I think the show is doing a very affirming job of saying how school systems are fucked up, but also at the same time, centering literal Black joy in young Black children that oftentimes are criminalized, seen as these, what's the word that Hillary Clinton used? Predators. And I want to change that. And that's the whole reason why we're doing this, because we're centering them and not ourselves. So the first question or activity, engagement, that I want to ask is for you yourself: how did teachers, adults, whoever was managing you in your childhood discipline your actions, but also how do they discipline your feelings? And if you can't really, separate those two things and it was just discipline in general, that's cool. I mean, you know what I mean? But so yeah, take a moment. I'm going to give like 2 to 3 minutes, do a little reflection, a little processing, but how did teachers and adults in your childhood discipline your actions and feelings? So we're going to start there. And please feel free to put your comments in the chat and I'll read a couple aloud. If you would like to verbally say something, please raise your hand. We can give you the space of 10 to 15 seconds. And then I'll give my experience. Oof, y'all gonna make me cry, because these are all things that I think is more communal. We have more connections in the way we were disciplined and in the way we were loved. That's all I'm gonna say for that. But I mean, these will lead right into what we're gonna talk about when I talk about discipline and management. But Ariel first started off by saying, I was often told to control my emotions by my father, which resulted in me bottling them up. Hillary said, making it clear that showing strong and especially negative emotions was not something that should be done in public. Christina said, home restrict, school, some teachers talk to me. Lisa said, not great, invalidation, made assumptions, yelling, etc. Stop crying. Jennifer said, a lot of times my feelings weren't invalidated. Courtney said, taking away privileges like recess or social time. Me, when I tell you the amount, my mom has saved all of my report cards from the time I was like in pre-K or whatever those were, like evaluations of me up until 5th grade. And all of them said he talks too much. And they used to literally put me with my back to the classroom to try to stop me from talking. And I was like, y'all thought it because I can enunciate. The wall is my, what's that called? It enhanced my voice. Ariel said, I was also very well behaved in school because I liked learning. I always thought teachers rewarding kids who were really able to control their emotions and bodies in the classroom. Gabriella said, taking privileges away, not talking through the reasoning behind the punishment, AKA no clear and open communication behind actions and decisions. Ellen said, yelling, taking away things that we look forward to or privileges at home, could not express anger, speak out. Exactly. Also, shout out to my coworker, Ellen. That's my queen. Courtney said, echo chamber, yes, me. And I was well behaved in school. Absolutely. And I start there because I think so much of the work that we have to do as leaders, as teachers, as educators, as the adults in the classroom, we have to some capacity, understand and process through our own ego and the ways that we're coming into classrooms and the ways that we visualize, ways that we have this perspective of what management means. Because a lot of times it's rooted in this unhealed child that stayed back here that we never actually got over. And we use that conditioning as a way to then manage other children. Um, absolutely. So the first part that I actually want to start on before actually talking about I'm going to give kind of a historical analysis, quick analysis of management and discipline. But I actually want to start first with my understanding and my interpretation of social and emotional learning and how cultural learning can be implemented through that. So the first question that you don't have to answer this. I just want to put it in everyone's perspective in their mind to think about throughout this is over the past, 2.5 years that COVID has been around, there's been a greater understanding and implementation of social emotional learning. And it's greatly impacted schools across the nation. Absolutely, I agree. But is this the answer to our youth needs, and what is missing? And so for me, I ask that because absolutely I'm a proponent for social emotional learning. Next slide. But, part of me is that very critical, what's the word? What her character is. It's like that, somebody's like, this is going so great. And it's like, but is it? Because I think there's a huge part of this that we are missing, in that when we implement social emotional learning, we almost assume and we have this expectation that kids know what it means to be social. They know what it means to be tethered and have a very good understanding of their emotions. So I just wanted to first start by giving this definition through CASEL, which is social emotional learning. It's a methodology that helps students of all ages to better comprehend their emotions, to feel those emotions fully and demonstrate empathy for others. These learned behaviors, okay, you see that, are then used to help students make positive, reasonable decisions, create framework to achieve their goals, and build positive relationship with others. So notice that wording, it goes from literally talking about comprehending and feeling their emotions and then learning their behaviors. So there's kind of a dissonance here. According to CASEL, the 5 tenets of social emotional learning are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and making responsible decisions. So much of this that I want to point out is that a huge part of social emotional learning right now, in any evaluation tool, any description, any kind of like programmatic thing that they're talking about, focuses and continuously relies on these words of management and control. Next slide. And that to some capacity, SEL is about student self-management and teacher educators means to control. This alone, I believe, and I've seen, I've witnessed, I have felt, can create an environment and relationship between the teacher educator and the student that can be more harmful and have detrimental effects on their ability to self-regulate and build a relationship to others. Again, this is why I just want to point this out now, because I think a huge part of this comes down to what management means and how so many of these tools that have been developed under social and emotional learning are not incorporating or not taking into account the means of the production of culture. Next slide. And so for me, not to always come back to the word impact, because like the program I manage is Project Impact, but for me, when you add culture and minus management, it equals impact. And so this is then the ability to establish a classroom culture that will not only aid the needed production, and I put production in quotes because of course kids are in school to understand what success is. And again, I put for students to ensure they succeed. Yes, there's this dissonance that we have to be accountable for, that like, yes, we want this to be a liberatory experience for them to be accountable and responsible for their actions, understand who they are, but also there is kind of this like capital governmental need that they do succeed. So just being mindful of that. But then I want to introduce affirming methods of connection and care that are often missed or absent from the classroom that is being managed by an adult that replicates punitive systems. And so for me, when that happens, the slide came a little early, LOL. But when you add that culture, so much can happen. It can be affirming, it can be that healthy environment, it can be this brave space for kids to thrive, to learn, to build connection and relationships. So that kind of just like the introduction. This next part, I will put a, what's the word? What a discretion that like, it's going to be a little heavier content, but I think it's important that we understand the context to where we're coming from when we discuss classroom management, to then leap into understanding that impact and that harm that it's having to then build better culture. So what is classroom management? In these definitions that I found over, like Merriam-Webster, like, the Illinois Department of Education, I looked a lot at Boston's Department of Education, because if you didn't know, Boston, Massachusetts had the first Secretary of Education that began this like formation of public education that then kind of like inspired other states. I think this was like when they were still territories, but whatever. It was the foundation, the inception of public education. But in all of these, when talking about classroom management, it talks about control of the classroom, student self-control, promoting and rewarding positive achievement, attention, and behaviors. I like the comment that somebody had said that, disclaimer, thank you, Courtney. I like the comment somebody said about able to control their emotions, bodies in the classroom. Because a lot of times that's what it comes down to, is how you're able to like be disciplined. But a lot of times classroom management also, again, to come back to that word of behavior, is to prevent distraction and harmful behaviors that then impacts others. This then, next slide, comes to the idea of where discipline management came from. In the creation of public education, not to give a huge timeline, but as I said, it kind of started with this, oh my gosh, why can't I think of words today? With this framework by, I want to say his name was Horace Mann. He was the first Secretary of Education out of Massachusetts. And so it started there, and then it kind of like developed into other states of what public education was. Here specifically in Illinois, what I wanted to point out was that Francis Parker out of Quincy, Illinois, kind of was examining the way in which public education was being controlled and managed and produced throughout the state. And for him, he actually went and followed European models of encouragement and kindness to counteract this idea that discipline and punishment was happening within the classroom. A lot of times in the late 1800s to early 1900s, people like Francis Parker and other educators were exploring how connections through education discipline were to be in place of parents. And so the Latin term is loco parentis, that in this shift of like homeschooling to then, I want to say in like the early late 1700s to early 1800s, that's where there was like that one classroom where there was kids from like pre-K to 8th grade and you all shared. And then it was required, I think federally, that kids were in school from ages of 7 to like 15. And then they went out to being like these capital workers, like in the farm, in the industrial, whatever, all that stuff. But what they were finding is that a lot of times these kids were being shifted into the classroom as a means of education, of learning these new skills, whatever that may be. But a lot of times it was the lack thereof discipline that was being used and or that was being formalized in the home. And so teachers then were taking on these disciplinary figures in kids' lives, of getting them on track, of understanding what self-control was, of understanding what discipline and managing their own kind of like needs, wants were. That's kind of like the foundation of it. But what I found throughout all of this is that actually what paralleled the creation of public education was the inception of juvenile justice. And so, next slide, please. And so, as I was saying, the evolution of education paralleled the response of states to begin criminalizing or rehabilitating youth and to distinguish them from adult perpetrators. So I want to say it was as early as like 1830, 1835. There was a case study that was done, and I can send all of this after the presentation. But these historians were looking back at adult jail like records, and there was kids as young as 10 years old being thrown into adult jails for up to 2 weeks to be housed until they were seen in front of a judge. And so a lot of times, like the people that were advocating for the youth, trying to get them into public school so that they weren't stealing, because a lot of times these crimes were stealing a pair of shoes, or it was stealing food from the market, and then they caught you running away, and then you're thrown in this jail cell for 2 weeks, because they thought that was the best solution for you. And so when I was researching this, this is where the creation of juvenile justice came from, because a lot of earlier in that time, social workers or social service providers were finding that the kids that they were reaching, and the kids that were coming into like their homeless youth shelters, were actually kids that were coming right from adult jails. And so something I want to point out is that, so I put in here in 1907, the first juvenile courts, or what they call parental courts, were created here, literally in the city of Chicago, across the street from Jane Addams' Hull House, which then other states followed. Two names that I want to point out here is, her name was Julia Lathrop and Lucy Flowers. So these two women were seen as like pillars in the community. They were like white women who were educators, who ran the daycare, who ran the youth homeless shelters at Hull House. Julia Lanthrop actually traveled the state of Illinois to better understand how jails were housing, how they were treating and rehabilitating adults and youth. And then Lucy Flowers followed up because she was more of like a prominent figure in the community with funds, with her connections of state powers, to better understand what it meant to have a separate, distinguishable kind of court legal system for juveniles that weren't following the rules in education, that weren't being disciplined enough at home, that were homeless, that didn't have parents to discipline them or teach them that. So this idea of the parental courts, like the first iteration of it, the building was across the street from Hull House, which when we talk about school to prison pipeline, I mean, like if you can just visualize it, like literally a kid can act up in the classroom and you're like, I'm not having it, literally walk them over to the courtroom. And a lot of times it was these higher figures in as social service providers like Julia Lanthrop and Lucy Flowers, who were the perpetrators for juveniles to be incarcerated. The earlier iterations of it in a lot of texts said that it was more informal. So what would happen is that the youth would be jailed essentially, so like put in some kind of facility. And then if they had parents or they had guardians, those were then brought in. And instead of like it being like the youth and then the judge like in the front, they were kind of like at a table and the judge kind of just walked them through what their goals were, like how they should be reinstated into public education, what it means to have an education, what it means to have a job, blah, blah, blah. And then the parent, whoever had to sign off on a legal contract saying they would follow these rules to then get the child back on track, right? And I'm saying all of this because it's going to follow future context. And so from that, when other states started to follow, they started realizing that this informality within juvenile justice was not working. This comes up to, I want to say, 1940s to the 50s, to where because of this informality for the first 30 or 40 years of juvenile justice, there a lot of the folks in elections or people trying to become politicians were noticing that, okay, these aren't working. These kids who were first criminalized or seen as criminals at the age of 9 are now 19 doing larger crimes. Recidivism rates were a lot higher. How do we keep these kind of kids from coming back onto the streets and removing this informality and making it more formal? And so I'm not going to get into the weeds there, but essentially they formalized the juvenile justice system. They started incarcerating youth at much younger ages and not necessarily having this informal matter of somebody's going to take care of you back home, but that they will actually be incarcerated. I say all of this because all of these rules and regulations, this idea of informality, paralleled the ways in which schools were also formalizing ways of punitive actions and classroom management, and also school management. And so that's where we see the idea of zero tolerance coming into play. Though it was like credited much later in the mid like 1970s to 1980s onward, it was actually something that was informally introduced and being perpetrated through schools early on. The idea of timeout, I kind of said it earlier that I was like when I was in second grade, it was what, 2002, 2001? And me being like literally put in timeout because I talked too much. But even that, as we see in movies, we can see like in popular culture and visual culture, this idea of like timeout, the kid with the hat be put in the corner. It was like this reoccurring role that would happen. And then also this idea of behavioral centered models. So similar to juvenile justice and the way that kids were incarcerated, a lot of times, a lot of the language that was happening in these documents was centered around their behaviors. And so Julia and Lucy continuously said this in their kind of appeals to their funders, to their donors, to these state powers that were putting in place these juvenile justice centers, that kids' behaviors were impacting then they didn't say culture, but more so the nature of the classroom. And so that's why kids had to be put on this legal contract to then get better. And so behaviorally, they would get better. If we parallel this as well with the evolution of youth development and all of these frameworks and models of what it means to develop youth behaviorally, right? Like all of these are literally correlated, but they were living in like separate spheres. And so while the theorists were understanding behavior, of what conditioning meant, the juvenile justice system was also noticing and implementing ways of controlling behavior, while classrooms are also noticing, managing, implementing ways of controlling behavior. And so these things are all happening, right? Like in the early 1900s, mid 1900s, things are getting published, kids are being punished, kids are being incarcerated. But then in a sense, schools were almost detached from that because it's not the legal system. But this is where it gets a little bonkers, is that even up to today, so I looked at a report from the Justice Center, which is the, and I can send this report as well, but it's the Council of State Governments Justice Center FY18 to FY19 report. And in that report, it states that approximately 60,000 youth across US public schools were referred to juvenile justice centers due to, and this is solely on attendance, due to truancy. And so that then was the first iteration for so many of these youth to being incarcerated and or kind of like indoctrined into the penal system here in the United States. I say that because a lot of times this is happening, like kids are being indoctrinated into the criminal justice system because of things that they may not have control over, because of things that schools may be implementing the zero tolerance policy, having them do outside school suspension, in school suspension. Parents are noticing this, not sending their kids to school, right? Like all these things happen, and truancy is like the one thing that we can control and incarcerate. And that 60,000 kids, and this was the last year before COVID, so FY18 to 19, that last full year. To parallel that, every year, the US Department of Justice states that approximately 60 to 70,000 youth are rotating through the juvenile justice system. So those numbers are not indistinguishable. I think they parallel each other, that literally in 2018 and 19, 60,000 youth were referred to the US Department of Justice for truancy, but at the same time, 60 to 70,000 youth are being rotated through juvenile justice centers, juvenile detention centers, justice centers, whatever you want to call it. And I think this is continuously happening because of this evolution of education that parallels the response by the state to criminalize, quote unquote, rehabilitate youth. I think a lot of times what's happening is that this hierarchy is being mimicked through the state into schools. And then that's where a lot of this like dissonance is happening, and why there is such a need for kind of like classroom management, because I don't think we've noticed it enough as educators that like the education system literally mimics that of the justice system. That the things that we do actually perpetrate and condition youth that we are criminalizing through the classroom by saying that they need to be disciplined, punished, positively rewarded. That actually happens as well in the criminal justice system. So for me, that's where I think, while I was talking earlier about these legal contracts that would happen informally between parents and youth with the educators and or these hierarchies of commands at schools like deans, principals, counselors, etc. These are also happening, as we may know as educators or folks in schools, through IEPs, through treatment plans, through behavioral model approaches. If people don't know, an IEP is an individual education plan. A lot of times kids living with disabilities are put on those so that they have this like plan of moving forward within their education. But I find more recently, there's a lot more kids that are being connected to IEPs or who are being put through IEPs who may have developmental kind of needs that like schools need to address. But a lot of times kids on IEP plans are the ones that are being impacted the most by these behavioral centered models that then criminalizes their actions or their behaviors by not at first addressing their feelings or the needs that they have. And so for me, it comes really down to the idea of expectation versus production. That learning has come to a place of reward versus punishment, that youth are expected to perform in a way that quantifies their worth and ability to be in this world. For me, something I always tell my youth is that like, okay, there's an expectation of you to be here. What is that expectation? It's to show up, it's to sit still, it's to learn, it's to speak when spoken to, right? Like there's all these things, and that is to then produce you to become, I mean, to be very honest, to become this like productive human in society, to have a job, to have a family, to reproduce, to die, and then it keeps on going, right? Not saying I tell them that, but that's the whole idea of production. And so I think a large part of this management, this idea of classroom management that people keep on coming back to, are these two core tenets of expectation and production, that we have an expectation of kids in the classroom, and we need to manage that to then produce them to be the certain type of person in the world. And that's just calling it what it is. Next slide. And so I think this is why I asked that initial question is, what is the expectation and production of adults onto youth? So schools and the way that we do school is for adults and not centered around youth, to be very honest. I think a large part of this is because we as adults know what the need is in the world is to produce these like productive, safe humans in the world. So that because we have this expectation of who they need to be. But those are our needs that we're putting onto them versus understanding their needs and how that actually leads the classroom. And so this is why I'm so kind of like heavy and why I really discuss the idea of criminalization of kind of the punitive penal system here in the United States is because we literally need to be critical of the ways in which we discipline and manage youth within these spaces. I think the school to prison pipeline is a thing because of this. Prisons indirectly impact schools and their environment. And that's not just from saying that schools incarcerate kids, but kids in schools, parents are incarcerated. As mandated reporters, a lot of times we're first indoctrinating kids into that. Unfortunately, for one, because we have to for their safety, but then that kind of starts then the evolution of parents being involved in the court systems, of kids being involved in the court systems, all of that, right? But then also schools directly impact prison detention centers and their environments. From my work over the past 8 years, a lot of times when I go into these alternative high schools, when I work with incarcerated youth, when I work with folks who were previously incarcerated, a lot of times, even when they're in the system, it's perpetrated onto them that they need to get an education to move forward in life, to understand their goal, to be a productive human in society, right? And so it's like this kind of like rotating flow, ebb and flow between the two that feed each other, that we're not necessarily calling out, but instead we're continuously leading into by perpetrating this heavy expectation of discipline and management. For me, I always say behaviors are not the source of why discipline is necessary. Capitalist necessity to produce workers is. I'm gonna say that again. Behaviors are not the source of why discipline is necessary. Capitalist necessity to produce workers is. I think in all of this, youth need to be cared for, not managed. Plain and simple. You can care for behaviors. Of course, a lot of times when you have a classroom of 30, when one kid is behaving and or quote unquote acting out, which is a question I get 19 times a day, you say, well, how can I have them sit down and them not disrupt the classroom, blah, blah, blah. And then a lot of times the response is discipline. It's a discipline action. It's sending them away. It's having an aide to manage them in the classroom, as opposed to literally like bringing them in to care for them. And a great example of this, and not to get off track, I'm gonna come back, but just the other day I had a youth who, we had an event here and I could have easily controlled and managed it and made her act a certain way. She was having a reaction. And instead I leaned into the other kids that I knew who were in the space. I went to an extrovert and I was like, hey, I'm gonna call her Q. I was like, hey Q, this person is feeling like they want to, do this activity, but their friends aren't here. Can you sit with them? And she was like, absolutely, and brought them in. But that's because I took the moment, even though there was a million children around me, to bring this child in to care for them and kind of like let the other kids who are creating the environment, the culture in the space, help produce that and support that child. So when I say be critical, I mean literally question everything. That's why I had the principal at Abbott Elementary on here, because she's critical of everything. She does it in a funny way, but she asks the questions that a lot of other people don't ask, which is the most important thing to do when caring for our youth. So take a breath, take a sip, hold on. So after all of that, just understanding a little bit of background context into the history of discipline and management, into how it feeds into the prison industrial complex, how it feeds into the penal system here in America. So now you ask the why, or the how. How do we then change this, shift this, rebuild this, repair this? But to do this, I think we need to first understand what culture is. Me, Courtney, and Ariel had a very funny moment before we came on here. I always thought when I heard the term 2 cents, that it meant like 2 senses, like this is my 2 cents. I didn't know it meant like physical money, like 2 cents. So when I wrote this, I literally put my 2 senses. And it's kind of intentional because my 2 senses of understanding what culture is both as an insider and an outsider, not just within the school system, but I think being like a brown queer person, I'm always on the inside outside, right? Like I got 1 foot in the water, 1 foot out. And so that's where kind of like my conceptualization around my 2 cents came in. So anyways, the way I define culture, my 2 cents, is it's the art, not just physically, but kind of like metaphysically, the art and other manifestations of human connection and how this occurs collectively in shared spaces, beliefs, customs, actions, and feelings. That's my 2 cents. If you like that definition, write it down. Trademark me. My girl Merriam-Webster, though, via the interweb, defines culture as the characteristic features of everyday existence, such as diversions or a way of life shared by people in a place or time, the integrated pattern of human knowledge, belief, and behavior that depends upon the capacity for learning, and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. As you can see, Marion, she's a little way back when. She's still maybe stuck in the 1970s, because this definition of culture, again, to go back to the things that I'm trying to rebuild, to be critical of, is literally it says the capacity for learning and transmitting knowledge to succeeding generations. I think it's very intentional that the word succeeding generations in there, because the whole idea of culture is that you have somebody to, like a succession, like somebody to then do it justice and to succeed in it as well. So that's where I want to start, of understanding, and you as well, wherever you are, understand what culture means to you. If you have a different definition, if you want to add anything to my definition, please feel free. I love feedback. So how classroom culture can impact learning. This is kind of like the meat, right? For me, these are kind of like my 5 tenets. I have to think about 3s and 5s. Like I do things in 3s or 5s. And so this is where I think kind of like the core is, and how we can be a part of this exploration and engagement in developing this classroom culture. Number 1, and I'll go through each of these individually, but number 1 is center growth and new modalities in learning. Number 2, creating ethics of care. That I get from Patricia Hill Collins' Black feminist thought. Number 3, destigmatize hierarchies, collaboration, and connection to others. Number 4 is emphasize accountability, responsibility to self and others. And number 5 is to establish learning as an opportunity rather than a demand. So number 1, growth and new modalities of learning. For me, this is where, again, coming back to art, don't mean to center that in everything I do, but I'm literally surrounded by it. That's where I believe the implementation of culture leads to growth by exploring creative and expressive ways of learning. And so for me, this is a very visual, a very kind of like visceral thing that I want all of you in the spaces that you share, that you lead, that you guide, that you mentor, to take note of, and like literally just take a step back after you provide the directive or the lesson and literally just watch. For me, I learned this because in one of the first classrooms that I kind of led, I think I was 19, and I was a prevention educator at a domestic violence shelter. And I was going into classrooms for like 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, teaching youth ages, it was like 9, I think I started in like 2nd grade, all the way to high schoolers, about what healthy relationships were and what unhealthy relationships were, because I worked for a domestic violence shelter. And when I would give the directive, I would give the activity, we would do one like think like a man, think like a woman, and like they would have to put things in each box. And then, when you remove the lines of what those things are, like both people do them, so you deconstruct gender. Anyways, but when I would give the directive, I would like literally stand back, or I would sit down, and watching them process and understanding the ways that they're learning, that they're engaging, you would have the kid with the headphones in, who's kind of like bobbing his head, tapping his foot. But then always, I promise you, it's the kid listening to music that always has like the deepest thought. And he would share it, and everyone would be like, damn, you were holding that in, right? Like, were you listening to that? Which I always loved. You have the doodlers. Me, I'm a doodler. Everything piece of paper I own has flowers on it. Don't know why. It's always been my thing since I was like in kindergarten. But that's how kids concentrate as well. That's how they're processing. That's how they're producing the knowledge that you're expecting from them. You have the foot pencil tappers. You have the bathroom break dancer. This I put in here, that's like an individual experience. I used to have kids that would like go to the bathroom and just like do a little shimmy, do a little shake. And I would go because they'd be late, and I'd be like, what is happening? And they'd be dancing. But they would come back and be like, okay, so while I was dancing in the bathroom, I thought about this. And a lot of times that's, again, I'm mind blown by that comment of like that your body was also controlled. Those are the kids that physically need to get it out to process what's happening, because they're literally holding it in. And then the snack connoisseurs, my fave, the ones who always got hot Cheetos for 25 cents in their book bag. And for those kids, it's literally chewing or eating the same thing every day that I learned this thing in high school that I tried a lot that never really worked for me, was they said, if you eat crackers. What are those square crackers that like if you eat them while you're studying and then you eat them while you're taking the test, that like you remember better. And it was Cheez-Its for me. Now I don't have a snack that I do that anymore for because I'm not trying to remember anything. But those kids as well. And so I think a huge part of classroom culture is a lot of times for me it was like on the first, I would say 2 to 3 weeks. Like I'm not even going to say a day because kids change. Like their lived experience, things they're experiencing at home. They may come in with that energy 1 day a week. Maybe on Tuesdays, that's when they don't see their dad because dad works all night. So the next morning on Wednesday, they come in very frustrated and upset. Like I would catch on to those things and understand what was this modality they needed to learn and be engaged in the classroom. And how can other kids benefit from that? How can other kids engage in that? And I think this is where we as leaders, as teachers, as mentors have the opportunity to lean into these modalities of learning, of knowing that, okay, if half the class really engages well with this type of music, I'm going to play this type of music and they're going to remember better so that when they're taking the test, we listen to sonata number whatever, and I'm playing again now, and maybe that helps them better with producing the test, the knowledge production that you need to say you have a successful class, whatever. Say it means you give them a specific snack when you're doing a specific lesson plan of, say, every time you do math, we all chew gum. Every time we do reading, we're eating Cheez-Its. And so that when we take the test on it, we all eat the exact same snack. I think implementing those and letting kids lead in those is the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed. Sometimes I used to have kids that would like do their foot tap or like the pencil tap, and they would like, like make a little sound. And so then I remember one time I was leading kids through like the cycle of violence, not to get dark, but we were like talking about the cycle of violence one day, and the last day we like revisit all the 4 previous days lessons. And when we were doing the wheel of violence, which is like, the honeymoon phase and all that, and then you get all the background, like some kid was tapping and he was like singing the song. Somebody was like, oh my gosh, he was singing that song, this whatever is blank. When I tell you a tear just like fell from my eye, because in that moment I was like, oh, this modality of learning for them, which was literally hearing a noise, brought them back to that experience of what they learned. And then everyone in the classroom was like, oh my gosh. And then they all started like making noise or being like, I wonder what I was doing in that moment. So I would lean into that. I would base your foundation in that, of not coming in with this management style of saying, we're all going to sit here in silence while we do X, Y, and Z, that we're going to avoid food, that we're going to avoid art. I think that's lame. I know it's like, I don't know what else to call it. But I would say lean into that. Kids' minds are so expressive. They're so exploratory. They're so creative. And as opposed to literally blanding that down and like pushing that away, I think leaning into that and like setting your foundation of your classroom on that. Number 2, I'm gonna take a sip. An ethics of care. And earlier when I said this, I mentioned Patricia Hill Collins, who is an academic and scholar. She's kind of like one of the first Black women scholars to focus on this kind of like of putting text behind Black feminisms, Black women feminism. And in her kind of 4 tenets of epistemology, and epistemology means production of knowledge, she has an ethics of care. So I use that as kind of like my foundation because I think she's brilliant. And I think when we root the way that we're learning, that we're producing in like this accountability and responsibility to others in care, this kind of like going back to my first PD, that so much can happen. So for me, when I think about culture, it literally happens when people in the environment care for one another. Simple. This happens more organically when knowledge is valued, different ways of learning is encouraged and shared, process is implied over product, and they are reminded we are humans and humans make mistakes. When I say an ethics of care, I think people think, or the assumption is that you're just here to support, that you're here to make things better. Absolutely not. I think an ethics of care is shaking shit up. Like an ethics of care is literally understanding the ways in which mistakes are happening now and moving through them and making more mistakes to get to the place that we need to be, wherever that is. I don't even want to name it. That implies process. That implies that we are learning through our mistakes, that we're learning through our successes. I think in opposition to management, management is all about the reward. Management is all about the product in which you get to. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here for the process. I'm here for the care that happens when we make mistakes and we learn through them, and we care for one another in that process. That has to happen organically for culture, for the classroom culture to work well. I say that when knowledge is valued and different ways of learning is encouraged, this going back to my first point, but when a youth who comes in, and we always, every classroom I've been in, you always have that one kid that's like, can I tell the story? And you already know the story is about to be 19 minutes long. And they tell you this like really awkward story that they like found a squirrel and then like X, Y, and Z happened, and then they blah, blah, blah. And the other kids in the classroom, like, they know this is a storytelling kid. But for me, I value that so much because I'm like, okay, you're telling me this. What's the value? Like, what was the lesson you learned? What was the value? How can we use this in our classroom? Like, and so you want to always like recenter that, but you do that because I'm not going to make the kid feel shamed or guilt them or punish them because they're not centered on the learning directive that we're on at the moment. They're literally leaning into their humanness, like them being little humans in the world, trying to figure out on their own. And us telling them that we value that I value that you have this long ass story about a squirrel, and not saying, no, you're not paying attention. I'm going to punish you for X, Y, and Z or blah, blah, blah. Because I've seen that happen over and over again. And so valuing their knowledge. And I think that's where Dr. Collins always comes into play with the 4 tenets of epistemology, because a huge part of that too is dialogue, of understanding that like when we talk, we're learning from each other. When we're discussing, when we're having a conversation, we're learning from each other. And that encourages them to want to be in your space. That encourages them to want to trust you. I think when you start with these things, when you start with this idea of care that builds your culture, kids will have a buy-in. And they're not gonna, I have those kids that come into my room now when I lead art therapy groups, and they want to talk shit about their teacher first and foremost. And I'm like, okay, but what were you learning? How are they encouraging your learning? And what did you actually learn? And what are we walking away with? Like, I always want to center that. So when they go back, I'm reproducing hopefully what the teacher's trying to do, but that I'm leading through the care for not only the youth, but also the person that's leading the directive or the classroom. Because care has to come both ways. But then with that, so in talking about the adult that's leading, my third tenet, I guess I'll call them tenets, of classroom culture is destigmatizing myths, whatever that word is, of leaders and people. I say this because our youth are taught from pre-K, even probably before onward, that they have to see teachers as the one in power and control. For me, I've noticed ongoingly that this creates a very harsh, rigid boundary and barrier that they have built as a protective factor. And that's their resistance. It's not personal. It's not saying that you're a terrible teacher, you're a terrible leader, you're a terrible mentor. It's just a product of the environment that school has created for them. My first step in destigmatizing this is literally acknowledging that boundary and ask what their needs are to navigate that feeling so that the both of you can make the culture of the classroom conducive for learning and connection. When I say destigmatize, I think so much of the time, I've been asked by teachers who are like, the hard teacher or like the punitive teacher, them being like, all these kids come in and they have this idea of me that like, I'm a hard ass. And then and then I'm sitting in the classroom, then they start yelling. And they're like, why do they think that way? And it's like, it takes so much introspection. Like you literally have to understand how you're producing and mimicking and conditioning these myths, I can't say the word, for them in your classroom, in your environment that you've created. But with that, it's not that you change entirely who you are, because sometimes we are conditioned. It's like I said, it's a slow burn. If you have these ways that you manage your classroom, first acknowledging that when kids come in being like, hey, I'm kind of a hard ass, I'm working through it. If one day I get really blah, 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 like call it out, like call me in. No, I'm not call it out, call me in. Like, I think that's something that my leader here at SkyART, Devin, always says, like when conflict happens or when critique has to happen, call that person in. And I think when you tell youth that they have the autonomy and they have the worth of calling you in as an adult and the leader in the classroom, so much value and so much trust can happen. I've been called in so many times, the little kid be roasting me, but in a very beautiful, sensitive way, vulnerable way, that they'll be like, Mr. Michael, you said this 2 weeks ago, but you're telling us this now. Can you explain? I'm like, damn, you really called me in. I was like, you're right. Now I'm going to explain. And I acknowledge if there was a mistake in things I said, I'm going to acknowledge that. Also, you have to acknowledge the boundary of like, if it gets too out of hand, if like the kids are trying to like call you out your name or doing X, Y, and Z, also continuously acknowledging that boundary of like, okay, to an extent, I'm giving you respect, you give me respect. But these kids can read you down from a mile away of knowing that like, if it's genuine, if it's fake, And so I think starting there of understanding what myths do you have to destigmatize in your classroom, what things are you conditioned to do and that you need to understand and work through for yourself. Number 4, this also going back to Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought, 4 Tenets of Epistemology. She also talks about accountability, but here I also add a word, responsibility. I think, of course, with all of this, you ask, but how do I maintain productivity and make sure they do their work? For this, I just say, I got you. From the jump, discuss accountability. Build an agreement, establish boundaries, and emphasize their worth and affirm their willingness and ability to be present, to do their work, and their acceptance of you as their teacher leader. Here, I'm going to talk about this idea or this verbiage of an agreement later. But when I say emphasize accountability and responsibility, when I say an agreement, it's something that they have buy-in to, that, from the beginning, you're not saying you have to do this or you're going to fail. You have to do this, you're going to fail. You have to. Their entire life is them, are their parents, are their friends saying that they have to do something. When you say, when you're here, what things do you want to learn? What things do you want to emphasize? Maybe we have snack breaks, maybe we have blank. But you say, but for this to happen, the agreement is that we get our work done by 2 p.m. for us to have a 15-minute blah, and we're going to continue blank, right? Because you're emphasizing not just accountability on their part, but that they also have a responsibility to the entire classroom. I think this is where earlier I talked about the idea of individuality and collaboration. I think we're in this very strange time of everybody calls out, and I'm going to say call out intentionally here, everybody calls out that America, or just that our ways of being is very individualistic, right? That I agree. And that we have to get to this place of communal being, of collaboration, absolutely. But I think that's a very strong dissonance to try to emphasize to kids of being redact this idea of individuality that America's teaching you and be more communal and collaborative, we all gonna be little Angela Davises. Absolutely. But that's a slow burn. And those two things I think have to happen simultaneously. We have the very unique responsibility of being in kids' lives when they're literally figuring out who the fuck they want to be. And that takes space for them to be an individual, but it also takes space for them to learn and collaborate with other people. And I think when you tell them that that they have accountability in this and that they're responsible for both things of being you have a responsibility to yourself in the space, but you have a responsibility to other people, just name that. You can literally talk them through that of what it means to be responsible for yourself and other people in your space. And they can ask as many questions as they want. They can challenge it. They can critique it. They can call you in. You can call them in. But that literally within the first, week or two that you know them, I think here at SkyART, we do a beautiful job of sharing our shared values. But of course, for school, it's a little bit different because they have a product or there's production that has to happen that is the end goal of testing and all this other bullshit. So of course, we're gonna acknowledge that. But a huge part of that is that they have to accept that as well. I think if you start from a place of them disagreeing with it and not wanting to be there because of X, Y, and Z, it's not going to go good. And that's where a lot of times people then lean into and center more of the management style, because you have to manage these kids to get good test scores, to do blank, right? And so, yeah, so I'm going to say that for now, but I think it comes from accountability and responsibility on both ends. And then lastly, my favorite way of just leading and guiding youth is to establish learning as an opportunity and possibility. And so I'm not saying this to say that you're going to tell them you have to be here if you want to be a doctor, a firefighter, a blah, blah, blah. I'm literally saying to establish learning as a possibility of being. So just the other day, I had a kid come to me and be like, my teacher yelled at me because I'm not doing good at math. And they told me that if I don't do good at math, I can't be a scientist. I can't blah, blah, blah. And they were like, I just want to doodle and make art the rest of my life. Why can't I be an artist for the rest of my life? And I was like, who said you can't be an artist? I was like, look at my entire job. I was like, I literally get paid to come and make art with you once a week. And again, this is expanding and establishing that learning is a possibility, that whatever we're focusing on, we're centering, that has the possibility for you to lead whatever life you want to live. I think the youth that are managed so severely, and who are disciplined ongoingly at home, in the classroom, whatever other community space that they're in, a lot of times that kind of taints and that kind of like clouds their idea of what their opportunities or what their possibilities of life are, because so much of what they're doing is have to be accountable for other people's egos and what those people want them to do. That's just calling it out. I think that's what I said at the beginning, like we as adults have to put our own egos in check and understand how we're coming into these spaces. And so I think for the youth that we serve, we have to understand what their possibilities of being are and what they want to do. That's where I come back to the idea of what their needs are. And so if somebody literally says, I want to come in here and I want to listen to music once a day to blah, blah, blah. Maybe that means they like music is literally their interest. Maybe they don't play music yet, but it's something that you can lean into and you can establish as something in your classroom. Because I think from that, that's where, as opposed to classroom management, classroom culture, like maybe you have that like 5 to 10 minute presentation of, okay, what's something you learned in this classroom that could possibly be something you do in the future, as opposed to it being like a career day. A funny story I always tell, when I was in kindergarten, also I'm very blessed to have the mom that I do. We had a career day and I remember being like, a career, like I don't want to work for my life. And I remember being so anti it. My mom was like, no, like you literally have to decide what you want to be. And I was like, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to be a doctor. I don't like water. I don't want to be a biologist. From the early age, I was like, fuck 12. I didn't want to be a policeman. So all those things, my mom was like, what do you want to be? And I remember she put on like a Janet Jackson, like CD thing, whatever. And I was like, I got it. And she was like, okay, what is that? I was like, I'm not going to tell you, you're going to know tomorrow. And so I went to school the next day. And on my paper, I put, I want to be Janet Jackson's backup dancer. And I showed up in like my little leather, like black vest, my like little flared pants, my little boots. And I really tried to like be who I wanted to be. But I think it was because, as I say, I'm very grateful to have my mom. She literally set the tone for me that learning is the possibility of figuring out who you want to be. And thankfully, I also had teachers that encouraged that. Like I remember showing up, my teacher was like, she was jamming me on and I was singing, oh my gosh, what's that song? I'm not gonna sing it, that's embarrassing. But anyways, I share that story because I think for me, I tell kids that all the time and they're like, wow, you're so embarrassing. Like, why would you do that? And I was like, literally because I was able to experiment, to explore who I wanted to be. There was no expectation put on me. Like my mom didn't say, you have to do this. She continuously said, like, what are things that you're learning that you can possibly do? And I remember the word possibility always stuck with me. And I think that's the beauty of like that we have this unique responsibility to the kids we serve because we can also explore those possibilities with them. I mean, my kids are kind of letting me down because nobody said they want to be Janet Jackson's backup dancer with me, but whatever. Again, they're possibilities. They can be whatever they want to be. So yes, those are my 5 tenets. We're going to take, it's 12:12. We're going to take like a little 2 to 3 minute break. Just to, like get something to drink, stretch your legs real quick. And then we're going to come back with activity number 2. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll start talking about cultural models and interventions for the classroom. But put on a little dance break. You know, I had to give my girl Cheryl Lee a little shout out. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so we'll take 2 to 3 minutes, take a drink, take a sip, and then we'll go from there. Can you go back to the dance break? Okay, thank you. All right, I hope everyone is drinking their drink. I got my Starbucks this morning. I didn't have my passion fruit tea lemonade. I'm okay. I'm surviving. We'll do like 30 more seconds of watching my girl Cheryl Lee, a dream girl, if you didn't know. All right, so we're going to jump into, it's called activity, but it's like reflection. 1.2. So from the first question that I asked, my second question now is, what roles does discipline hold in your classroom, studio space, or organization? And are you managing actions or feelings or both? So the first one is more so your past. This is more your present. What roles does discipline hold in your classroom, studio space, or organization? And do you feel as though you're managing actions or feelings or both? So I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes to answer this question. I'll read a few and then we'll go from there. All right, I'm just gonna read the few that are here. If you have time, space to answer, please feel free. If not, it's okay. Christina said self-regulation to manage both. Ellen said we don't use the word discipline in our practice, period, same. Ariel said, in my previous job working with youth as a musician, I generally disciplined students if they were being unsafe with their instruments. So I would have a private convo while getting on their level and ask everyone to treat their instruments as if it was their baby sibling. Would you leave your baby sibling on a chair all by themselves? My brother used to leave me by myself all the time. So yes, he would. Kate said, we work with little ones, infants through pre-K. So discipline mainly centers around managing actions to keep everyone safe. Most behavioral issues stem from the little ones being unable to verbally express or identify their emotions. We make sure to use our shared values, which includes care, absolutely. Absolutely, Ariel. Would you leave your baby sibling in the car when it's hot or cold? Christina said self-regulation, meaning not giving others control of your emotions. Hillary said, I think there are lots of messages about how to show up, how to talk, how to act, etc. that are unspoken but undeniable part of the space of the museum where we hold our programs for teens. A lot of my work is working with young people to name those unspoken things and trying to disrupt them or process them together. Love that. I love the word disrupt. Come on, Hillary. However, because security presence is a necessary part of the museum that also comes with its own set of rules that speaks more to discipline or consequences that are out of my control as an educator. Absolutely. And then perfect transition, Ariel. We also created our own agreements as a group and held each other accountable. So thank you all for taking the time to answer that. I think those are great answers. Also, Hillary, you're coming with the words today. Come on, Hillary. But next, I wanted to focus a little bit on cultural models and interventions that I found to be helpful in this new rebuild disruption. Thank you, Hillary. In what classroom management was and how it can become classroom culture. And so the first one, why I said great transition, Ariel, is I find that when you have agreement, shared values over rules, that so much healthier, affirming, and brave spaces can happen. So what I believe is the first step is establishing a classroom culture that is affirming and healthy for everyone is to create a list of shared values that all students agree to rather than demands or rules that students have to have no buy-in and that mimic the pressure to abide or fear of breaking. And I say this because a lot of times when there's rules to be broken, that will be broken. And this is where I go back to that idea of highlighting mistakes, is that there's fear, there's shame, there's guilt associated with this pressure to abide by the rules. And that if you break them, that something bad will happen or that discipline will happen, that there will be some kind of penal action of being sent down to the dean's office, principal's office. Your parents will get called, you'll get disciplined at home for that, right? Like there's so much fear associated with that. And that's why like kids, I think daily children that I see that that I create good classroom culture with come to me and they're like, I did not want to come to school today because I was fearful or I was scared of blank. And that's terrible. Like, I hate that I have to address that, but I think it's important that if teachers start to understand that, like, when they presumably begin a new classroom with rules or mandates or, just very harsh and rigid ways of being in their space, that can create so much instability. And that's where then you think, oh, now I had to manage them because they're breaking the rules. And it's like, first of all, did they agree to them? Did you create them together? Do they have buy-in? Are they invested into being in your classroom? Do they trust you? Are you actually valuing the relationship, the rapport that you have with each kid that's in your classroom, right? Like, there's all these questions. And that's where I go back to when I was talking about agreements, because of course I'm not going to like have them sign it in blood like a Harry Potter type thing. But I think when you say, okay, these are the agreements we came to together, which means we have a 15-minute break per day to listen to music. We eat Cheez-Its when we study math. We do stretches in the morning before we actually start. We rotate the reader of the week and one person can do blah, 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 right? Like, there's agreement. And so that's where they also call you in of being like, I thought you said we were going to do blank, because that then teaches them responsibility and accountability. And that shows them that you can share these values with them. And that, because I promise you, everyday teachers are breaking their own rules or mandates, but they're not being punished for it, or these kids aren't holding them accountable because they have this very hierarchy kind of like vertical way of being in the classroom, when really it should be this like shared space, these shared values, these shared agreements that you both agree into and you buy into together, so that you can avoid and completely get rid of fear, of shame, of guilt. You can say one of your agreements is, we're going to make mistakes together and we're going to talk about them when they happen, right? Like, you can literally make that a shared value of, let's fuck up together. Don't say those words because they're children, but let's make mistakes together. That's number one. Number two, and I don't mean to like number these either. Like, it's not like it has to happen 1 to 3, but you know what I mean. But my second one is that respond to feelings over reacting to behaviors. And this is more for like adults, leaders in the room, right? Like, we react over their behaviors more than the child is reacting through their behaviors. I say respond to feelings because the kid could be throwing chairs or throwing pencils or doing something, inappropriate, like in the classroom. And so as opposed to being like, stop doing blank, being like, oh, you're doing blank. How are you, like, where are you feeling? Like, where is that coming from? did you eat this morning? Did whatever happen? Like understand what the feeling is, because they may be reacting in such way, but literally it could be like, oh, my dog just died, but they're not saying that because they don't have the vocabulary for other words, or they don't trust you enough to say that. So that's where so as I say, like behaviors are expressed in action, at times not intentional and meant to be harmful. Exploring the feeling that first, the feeling first can increase regulation of the feeling that leads to the behavior and encourages self-awareness for the youth. And so for me, it's always avoiding the why and the how of like, why are you doing this? Like how, like, what's the how question? Like, how can I help you? I hate when people say, how can I help you? Like, what do you mean, how can I help you? Like you literally are showing up for them. Don't ask the child how you can help them. You should know how you should help them. But ask more so the what, when, and where. Like, what are you feeling right now? When did you first get angry? Like, did you come into my room angry? Were you angry before? Like, I see that you're throwing this, that you're holding a part of your body, or that you're doing something like, where does it hurt? Like, where would you like to go? Would you like to be in here, right? Like, there's so many other things of, when you ask the what, when, and where, like you're not only regulating their social and emotional capacity, but you're regulating the environment too, of being like, what do you need right now? Like, when did this happen to you? Where would you like to go, or where, blah, 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 right? Like a huge part of regulation of social and emotional learning and regulation is not just regulating the youth that is acting out or behaving in this way. A huge part of that regulation is also the adult that is responding to this child. So when you're not regulated and you're just reacting, that will literally intensify what the child is doing or what the youth is doing, which will then lead to them getting disciplined because you reacted in such a way that then pushes them down this pathway of criminalization and penalty, of getting in trouble, getting more fearful, not trusting you, rather than you literally responding to their feeling and what they need from you in the moment, of understanding their lived experience and understanding their feelings, rather than just addressing and reacting to their behavior and or action. This is where I think it's very, I hope it's common that people say respond, overreact, but I also want to be very conscious of saying respond to feelings, overreacting to behaviors. And then the next one, this is something I keep on coming back to as well, but really just like building up your toolkit and your capacity for understanding nonverbal streams of communication and trust. And so allow for space, tools, and techniques, allow for space, tools, and techniques that allow youth to communicate with you without the fear of having to speak up or state in front of others. This can occur in many ways and can be a technique to build trust, connection, and a meaningful relationship. Not just like a, I'm the boss, you're the worker relationship, like a literal meaningful relationship that they can trust you and rely on you and connect with you. I say this one intentionally because for me, what I found that helps so much when I have the youth that that act up or behave in such a way that other people in the school system have named them as or labeled them as. A huge technique I do is I have individual journals for all the youth. I have the privilege of also having smaller groups of like 10 to 15 kids. So I understand it may not be a thing that you can possibly do with 20 or 30 kids, but it could. In these books, like I let them design the cover, right? Like they put their name on it, they do whatever they want to the front, to the back of it. Excuse me. But in the book, I say, okay, once a week when I see them, you know, in the book, tell me about something that happened during the week. Tell me about a feeling you have right now. Draw me a picture of something that represents how your week went. And so many of the times kids will like give me a very elaborate image on the page, or, you know, some give me poems, some give me song lyrics, like some who are like, I don't know what to write. I'll be like, give me a list of your 5 favorite songs that you've listened to over the past week. And then they'll be like, okay, got you. And they'll write the songs. And my response, the way I respond to them is that a week later, when they get the books back, even if they wrote nothing on the page, I respond to them with, I really appreciate that you showed up to the space today. I really like the necklace that you had on. Can you tell me about the favorite place that you visited, or like, what's your favorite food that you like to eat when you're sitting alone and you're comfortable in your bed? Like I ask them all of these meaningful questions because I want to get to know them. And then I'll share who I am too. As a therapist, there's like this weird ethics that they say, like, you know, like don't give them too much of who you are, you know, like allow them to lead the space. But that's more so for adults. But like with youth, like they literally need to trust you, know who you are as a person. And so a lot of times, like I will share what my favorite food is, an experience I had. I love telling my Janet Jackson story. Because that to them is like, oh, this person's a human. They're not just like somebody to discipline me and somebody that I should be fearful of. And so nonverbal streams of communication and trust are just amazing ways. So like one of the things that like made my heart warm in like what I think the first one I saw had to be like right before COVID, was like those teachers that like have like the special little handshakes with their kids. Though that takes a long time. Like, first of all, who got that time? Also, I don't have that good of memory to memorize all of those handshakes, but like, what a beautiful, like for me, I was like, that's a beautiful way of nonverbal communication, because you may have kids that have speech impediments. You may have kids that have disabilities that can't, like stand up or something, or kids that have neurodiversities that may not have the words for what you're asking them. Kids who may be colorblind, who can't see like those visual face maps of like where they're feeling, that I know some people do. But like, maybe it literally is like you touch fingers, like some ET moment. Like maybe it is like you hum something together. Like I think that's beautiful, because those are nonverbal streams of communication and trust, and that they know you're going to show up for them in that way. I have a kid that I work with at a school, and every time she sees me, we have to like literally like the first time I saw her, she was like running up to me and she stopped, and I thought she was like going in for a headbutt. So like I went in for a headbutt. And now that's just like the way we communicate. Like she'll just come up and we'll just like pound heads. Not to say like I'm physically here to hurt her, but like it literally is like a non-stream of communication of like, it was like a funny moment for her, that she was like, oh wait, this is somebody fun, somebody I can trust, somebody that's here to literally like show me love and care for me. And that's just our way that we show up for each other. Because there have been times where she don't even talk in the group. She'll just make art, but then she'll leave and she'll like lead her head in, even if she's upset, and then we'll do like a little head bump and then she'll leave. So there's so many ways that you can do that. And through that is how you can really communicate to them that you're there for them, as opposed to just being like, I'm here for you. You can literally just do that act and they know it and they feel it. And then the next one, I'm not gonna say last one, the next one is boundaries over regulations and punishment. And so this is where I go back to when I talk about understanding their boundaries that they've made over what it means to interact or trust leadership or people that are there to discipline them. Boundaries can just be a great way of understanding what are healthy and unhealthy ways of living and knowing each other in the spaces that you share. And so I always tell my kids, like, my boundaries are blank. Like, I mean, I am a hugger, so I'm not gonna say like hugging, but I know like I have kids who like their boundaries, like don't touch me or like don't high five me. I have a kid who, when we do check-ins, everybody in the group has to turn their back to them. And they know that. And I'll be like, okay, everyone turn. And we'll all turn. And then they'll say their piece. And then we all turn back, right? Like, because they've set that boundary with me. And I think in creating classroom culture, it can absolutely impact how you see boundaries in what is healthy and unhealthy ways of living and knowing. This can lead to conversations, discussions around, and just being very honest and open with them, like racism, white supremacy, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, disability, sexual health, all those things. Because when you just say regulations and punishment, like you're putting a cap on what they can know and what they can express to you and the questions that they have. But when you say boundaries, you can be like, okay, we're gonna have a boundary where we don't say anything derogatory, which includes blank, blank, and blank. Maybe there is that kid who's like, what is homophobia? What is transphobia? And you can explain to them what that means. I know, because of like all this weird shit that's happening in the country of like, things against CRT and like things against reproductive health justice stuff, like all these weirdos are happening, wanting to like get involved in it. But I think as easy as we can, having conversation discussions around them, and not being like, we're going to read white fragility, like to a group of fourth graders, but like, we're going to talk about what white supremacy is and how it's, showing them the cover of a history book that has like that white man's face on like the Egyptian Sphinx, right? Like there are ways that you can lead those, and you can say, we're going to set boundaries of blank as opposed to regulations and punishments. And when I say regulations and punishments, I think when you don't set boundaries, that's where you then have to regulate, manage, and punish somebody, because you're not setting these healthy boundaries for them. I remember in my elementary school, I grew up in Indiana, and all these little kids were homophobic because their parents were. So they would say like blank. And then when they would say it off cuff or whatever, because they were like making a joke or whatever, the teacher would be like, that's bad. Like you're getting sent down to the principal's office. And the kid had no idea that saying like the F word or the word gay was harmful, because nobody ever talked to them about it, or what those boundaries mean of when you use harmful language or when you use harmful nonverbal things to interact with others. And, like as a queer person, I used to be like, well, it wasn't directed at anybody. And so I used to be like, what is happening? Like, you never even told us we couldn't say a word. And again, it goes back to the idea of expectation and production, that there's an expectation that kids know what's harmful and what's not, when you're not literally talking about it or being transparent about it, being authentic about it, setting those boundaries. It's very easy to cross them, or to whatever, not cross them, but disrupt them, a different way of using the word disrupt. But I say all of these 4 things because I think, again, it's a slow burn. Next slide. And our teaching, I just want to be very cognizant that like our teaching practices and the ways that we do things literally mimics 400 plus years of productivity, professionalism, and pain that is the entirety of the United States of America. And I say that because that's where the idea of accountability and responsibility comes into play. That being an educator will impact the youth's transition into adulthood and shape their understanding of the world. Leading through connection, care, and culture can directly impact the ways they navigate through the world. And I say that in bold, like our teaching mimics these 400 years of productivity, professionalism, and pain, because that's where this idea of management comes into play. Because unconsciously, like, even though you may not be a history fiend and like you're all out here knowing about like chattel slavery that led to sharecropping, that led to what we know today to be the police, right? Like, you may not know that policing to today in the criminal justice system mimics that of slavery that was established 400 years ago. But there is this like tethered generational connection to that pain, to the idea of productivity on brown and black bodies, to the white standard that is professionalism. And our teaching literally mimics all those things. And it's and that's what I'm the first to say. It's very hard to have to lead a classroom where you have a directive, you have responsibilities to the etherm that is America, to show that you're productive and that you can create good workers. But that's where when you shift from managing that and being like, okay, I know the culture, half these kids probably have these generational things that are impacting them. Half these kids have this lived experience that's doing X, Y, and Z. How can I, as the person leading them, bring them in and call them in as much as I can to create a space that is productive, that is quote unquote professional, but that also addresses and that establishes a foundation that we're all coming from some sort of pain, of struggle, of fear, of shame around being here, but we're here together. And that's where this idea of like the ethics of care, of like building these really strong connections come from, because literally we have that unique responsibility of having them for that year, and then they go on to the next person. And so if you can establish that with them, if you're a second grade teacher, if you see them in an after school program for 7 to 13-year-olds, if you are a preschool teacher, whatever, like you establishing that with them now and understanding that like the ways in which they impact the world can change so much that they have control and autonomy over that, life-changing. And so that's where I just think for me in establishing these things, the importance of culture is that it can indirectly shift their self-awareness of what it means to be deserving of an education, what possibilities feel like. It can establish connection, relationships, and community. It promotes self-awareness and healthy boundaries and supports the development of not only the individual, but the school. I say this because I've seen, and to call it out because I love this person, but her name's Amani Tate. She's the resource coordinator for Blocks Together. And they're she works at Cameron Magnet School of the Arts, and they're one of the like 20 school community school grant recipients that like builds this like tethered connection of community and school. And she coordinates all of it. But she does so because she calls them in of being like, this is what's happening. I want to address your feeling, but I want you to know that like by you doing this, you're impacting everybody in the school as well. But you also have a responsibility to yourself, to developing yourself as an individual. And she just does this beautiful way of like creating this culture in the school where like kids know they're responsible for each other. They're responsible for themselves. They're responsible for the educators and the people in the school. And it's so impactful. And like, you can feel it when you walk into the school of like, yes, of course, there's meltdowns, there's fires that have to be put out every day with little kids experiencing X, Y, and Z. But that like, because there's one person in the school doing that, those kids are taking it back to their classrooms, that they then take it home. And that you're seeing this like, not just direct linkage, but also like generational linkage that parents then call her. I've been getting calls from parents at the school being like, oh, I know that you're doing art therapy groups with my kids. I have other kids, I have family members. I have questions about what therapy is. And it just like broadens the impact and the horizon of what's possible, not just for the youth that you're working with, but for the people that they're connected to. Also, like an example that I have from this past Friday is that I have one of my favorite little humans in this world. She came to me like family was going to like sleep doctors and all these things for like literally 2 years because she was having nightmares. Like we started working with each other. We externalized what the dreams were, not having them anymore. It's a beautiful thing, right? Like that's the impact of art therapy. But something that's even more meaningful for me is that like whenever she sees friends, family members, like her mom tells me this, of other people in her life feeling triggered, upset, feeling fearful, she'll go to them with like a pencil and a piece of paper. She's like, let's draw it. Or she'll be like, tear this piece of paper up and then reassemble it, right? Like, And for me, I'm like, that's the impact of building a culture for her, that like, when you are so authentic and organically real in what you're feeling in the moment, like this is an 8-year-old teaching adults what it's like to be so self-aware with yourself and what you're feeling and how to process that through the art. And that's really my intention with understanding what classroom management is and how to shift it to classroom culture. Because even when we as adults, the people leading the classroom, even when you sit down at a table with kids and make art with them, or you discuss what agreements and values are, and you build that culture with them, they will literally indirectly and also directly take those skills and those things that you're teaching them to others. Not just building their self-awareness and their ideas of healthy boundaries and healthy self, but also for other people as well. But with all of this, I feel like I pretty much shat on the idea of what management is, but management is not a bad word. I think the language and the production of tools and techniques around classroom management have just been annihilated and chewed up and spat out by people who want to punish brown and black kids ongoingly over and over again, wanting to punish young girls of color, wanting to punish disabled youth because they're disruptive to the overall production of capitalism in the world. So I just want to say management is not a bad word. And it's not a word to avoid now. It's just an action. It's a way of being that I just ask we be extremely critical of, that we're more mindful when navigating, creating, and leading a classroom. Like you can still go into your classroom during the summer into next year and being like, can you go back? Okay. Of being like, this is what classroom management was to me now, but this time I want to work over the next 2 to 3 years of creating better classroom culture so that it impacts these kids ongoingly. As I say, management skills are cool to have, but with youth, it is important we know and can identify the impact this has on their development and their sense of self during and after our time with them. This is where I think so much of us, our tools, our models, the way that we show up for other people is important. I think every single day somebody's like, like, how do you manage your schedule? How do you manage this? How do you manage that? And I don't want everyone to leave here being like, damn, manage the fucked up word, or like telling people like, you're being punitive because you're using the word manage. Absolutely not. Like, it's still a word that's going to be around us always because that's just the world we live in. But I think we can ongoingly have an impact in the way that we address it, that we change it. Next slide. Now you can do my little money one. Okay. So with all these skills, you're going to do something. And I just want to have this meme in here again. This is my favorite. And the next one. But all of this is only possible when you have passion and when you find your purpose in how to do this. What is your purpose as an educator, as a leader, as a mentor in creating the culture of wherever you work at, of your classroom, of your studio space? Like, you have to understand your purpose for being there too. That's where so much of this comes back. Like, I think so much of what I said, or like what people say about social emotional learning, is so centered on the youth. And like literally the name of my thing is youth-centered spaces. But that can only happen when we as the adults, we as the people that are grown, that have the appointments, that have the responsibility of leading them, understand our purpose for being there. But also when you have the passion behind it. So for me, I just like want to ask these 3 questions. You don't have to answer them, but in all of this, in shifting and rebuilding and repairing and disrupting, what is passion to you? How do you define it? And what is your purpose in this? But also, what is theirs? What is the purpose of kids being there as well, and the youth that you serve being there? I think when you continuously ask these 2 words, so much change can happen and so much impact can happen. And so last activity or reflection that I want to do is, how could you engage in new ways of leading your classroom through culture? So from what you have learned, discussed, processed, reflected, disrupted today, if everyone could give me, like a couple sentences, a word of how could you engage in new ways of leading your classroom through initiating this new idea of culture. I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes for this one. I'm just gonna read Ariel's for now. And if anyone has anything else to add, please feel free to take your time and type it in the chat and I'll read as we go. But Ariel said, I developed a music composition activity that we would do every week where students would say one word to describe how their day, week, summer, whatever went, then make up something on their instruments that represented that word and tell us that word again. We also almost always had rehearsal in a circle instead of a typical orchestra where I'm in front of them and they're all looking at me, LOL. My favorite part about band. Absolutely. Christina said, engage with students and allow them to express themselves freely, remind students to self-reflect and practice empathy to help with discipline to find out real reasons for acting out. Ellen said, I feel now that I can better engage more with individual participants who arrive in the space having a hard time and don't want to create. I can ask them what, where, and when. Oh, thank you. Tools, tools, tools. Yeah, and I would love, even after this presentation, this project, that we continuously ask, how could we engage in new ways of leading classroom spaces, organizations through this idea and this implementation and this rebuilding of culture. I think as we can see in the world now, culture is very rigid in the way like people think that culture is like this very just like spatial thing that only implies racial identity, ethnic identities, religious identities. But culture is so intersectional, it overlaps, it ebbs and flows, all of that. Kate said, implement the where, when, and what question when responding to big emotions. Rachel said community agreements and making sure to come back to them. Asking everyone their access needs for the day, being vulnerable with youth is a big takeaway. Okay, good. I knew I got it right. But yeah, I think that's all I have. Last note, last meme. You got this. Coming back to my girl Cheryl and Quinta. And if you haven't watched Abbott Elementary, they don't pay me. I'm not like a sponsor, but you should watch it. But yeah, I think y'all got this. It's so easy. No, it's not. I'm just joking. It really is hard. It's vulnerable. You're gonna have to be vulnerable. You have to ask a lot of questions, be critical, all of those things. But I think we got each other. As long as we do that, everything will be beautiful and we will move on and create a better world. LOL. I did not mean to keep this slide in here, but I did anyway. But this was my last one on the next episode of Hot Mess Express, because literally that's what I feel like I come into every space I go into because I'm so critical and people think I'm just a hot mess because I'm asking too many questions. As well, like, subscribe, share. I don't have a YouTube channel, but I'm going to write a paper about this soon. So I'll share that with Ingenuity. And so we can focus on that. But if you have any questions, you want more information, you're looking just to kiki, whatever you want from me, my email is here. It's michael@skyart.org. Very simple. Please come down and visit us if you have more questions about the organization. I'm very grateful for Ariel and Courtney for allowing me to do this and selecting me to literally talk shit and create new ideas around it, LOL. But yeah, that's it. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, email me, all of those things.
Thank you all so much for being here this morning and for joining us for today's session. And thank you to Michael. Michael, you are so brilliant. This was so life-giving, affirming for some of the things that I used to do when I was in a classroom a lot. Some things to elevate to our bosses at Ingenuity, making sure that we're creating that same kind of culture here. It's just absolutely wonderful. So thank you for sharing your expertise and centering youth in our classroom culture. We have a number of upcoming events to round out this academic year. So I just want to make sure everyone knows about that. If you're still trying to figure out your art look profile, or if you're like, what's an art look profile? We have office hours to help you. And Courtney and our senior data analyst, Angela Lynn, will go through some new features, help you get your profile up to date. Maybe you can't remember your password. They'll share different resources that can help you connect with schools and report on your impact. So that's June 1st from 2 to 3 p.m. And I'm dropping the link for that in the chat right now. And then we also have a wonderfully critical view of primarily literary arts, but we'll incorporate some of the other arts disciplines as well. And how we choose content that reflects the communities we serve or exposes our communities to something they might not otherwise encounter. And it's showing a wealth of perspectives of identity rather than reinforcing some problematic stereotypes. And this two-part series will give us the tools to critically examine our content and find ways to center other narratives. And that's led by our Constellation resident, Mojde Stokely, who is an absolutely brilliant social activist, artist, writer, educator, presenter, all of those things. So part 1 is June 9th, and then part 2 will be on June 30th. And I've got the registration link for part 1 in the chat right there. And finally, I have 2 things that I would love for you to do. Please, please, please do them. We can't do this wonderful work without you, so we need your input. So we want you to take a moment to do this exit survey so that Michael will know all the different ways that he was awesome and all the different ways that he was a hot mess. So we need you to do this exit survey. It's really short, just 3 minutes. And then in addition to giving us feedback on this session in particular, we want to know what your most important content areas are for next year. That's how we created this Constellation series that so many of you have been enjoying so much. And we need you to fill out our partner learning survey and share it with all of your colleagues. So we do not need, just one survey per organization. So if you take your survey, then ask all your teaching artists to take the survey. We want to know what all of you have to do. And we really, really want to get as many things as we can, as many responses as we can, so that we have the best overview or sample from the arts sector. So please take the survey. It only takes 15 minutes. And maybe you can schedule a little office break where everyone gets up and does a little dance, and then you all take 15 minutes to do the survey, and then you do another dance. Like, do it, make it happen. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the sunshine if you're the kind that likes sunshine, and we will see you at the next one.
Thank you, everyone.